Thank you very much for that. I do remember that interview. It got me into trouble with the Prime Minister because it was before I'd left, and it was thought by everybody in the place to be my attempt to get a new job by getting myself some publicity. So it didn't do me any favours at all. But I'm glad you mentioned the 2005 speech, because that's where I'm going to start in a moment. I'm going to speak completely unadorned by any visual stimulus or PowerPoint or anything like that. I was asked when I was asked to speak here, what medium would you like to present in? I thought, contemporary dance? Various forms of crocheting. I thought, no, speech. What better medium than the medium of speech to do a speech about how to do a speech to a conference of speechwriters? So that is the traditional medium in which I shall address you. I want to talk about the problems posed to the speechwriters in particular in the campaign for making the case for the European Union, because it is particularly difficult to make a great speech now, I think, on Europe. I'm going to talk about this campaign in Britain, and necessarily what I'll say will be quite domestic, because the paradox of the European argument is just how domestic it is. I mean, this is true everywhere in Europe. Timothy Garton-Ash wrote a very good book about the way that Germany pursued its national interest through its European policy, which he called In Germany's Name. It's a very common thing. But in Britain, the European argument is at times parochial and isolationist and nationalist. So we have to go through a domestic audience. And there's the first lesson that you always have with any speech, is who is your audience? And with this particular topic, it's posed in a very acute form, because of course you've got a wider audience than just your domestic electorate, because this is the very subject announces by its name that it's European. But at the same time, you've got to find a way of appealing to those people who hold the future of the country in their hands, and they are less susceptible to a grand European vision than you might hope or think, and I'm going to come on to that. Let me start with that 2005 speech, because I was trying to think back to when did anybody do a great speech on Europe in Britain? And I thought, well, it must have been one I wrote. Now, somebody once said that Wagner's music is much better than it sounds. And I can assure you I'm a lot less conceited than I sound. The reason I'm going to use this speech is precisely because the Prime Minister wrote the vast majority of it himself. The circumstances of it were very interesting, because Britain had just scuppered the budget a few days before, and it was Juncker, who was then the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, who the day before in the European Parliament had addressed the floor and had excoriated Britain and Tony Blair in particular. And I had prepared a thoroughly boilerplate speech full of protocol of the European Union and about Britain's presidency of the European Union. And it was full of boring facts, and it was thoroughly mediocre and entirely competent and perfectly fine and entirely unmemorable. And as soon as the Prime Minister heard that Juncker had done what he'd done, he said, right, well, we can't say that then. I think he was probably quite glad to have the opportunity to tear up my boring speech. He said, we're going to have to respond. And he went up to his flat and he wrote, longhand, in one go, a fantastic counterattack. Absolutely brilliant counterattack, which he then gave to me and I shaped a little bit, but essentially it was unchanged. I added only one thing, and it's the phrase I'm most pleased about in all my time working in Downing Street, the image that I like best. The point of the speech was that it's not true that Britain has no European social model, which was Juncker's accusation. Britain does have a social model, and Blair saw the Labour government as attempting to produce that, which is to say a marriage between a flexible market economy, but with lots of social protection. And he thought that was a better marriage than the European model, which in his estimation was failing economically very demonstrably. And that was the case he was making. And that youth unemployment, which was already bad in Europe and has worsened since, was testament to his case. It was also a warning that there was a large gap opening up between the people of Europe and the political elites, which the politicians were simply ignoring. And it came to me that the sort of biblical phrase, which we added at the end, the people are sounding the trumpets on the city walls, but are we listening? And beautifully, when he delivered it, he did it again. He paused, and then he said it again. The people are sounding the trumpets on the city walls, but are we listening? I don't think we were at the time, although they gave him a standing ovation, which suggested they probably hadn't been listening. And I'm not sure the people in this referendum campaign are listening yet either. So what I want to do is go through the four main arguments that have been adduced so far in the various speeches and literature for and against the European Union, to give you some sense of how well those arguments are going down with the public. And then just to end by suggesting how I think I would approach the task of selling the case of the European Union, which will be the side I would be on if I were directly involved in doing so. There have been a lot of speeches so far, most of them fairly unheralded and not very widely reported, but Cameron's done a number. Jeremy Corbyn yesterday, finally, belatedly did a speech, which was, if you read it, it was actually quite a good speech. Unfortunately, it was Jeremy Corbyn who was reading. But it did say all the right things. He did say he'd been on an intellectual journey, which I found rather unlikely. But it did at least conclude that he'd now decided that the European Union was something Britain should be a member of. Chuck Ramuna has done a lot of speeches, being incredibly active in this argument. David Miliband did quite a good speech about the diplomatic and security problems the other day at the LSE. And then on the other side, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove have done sort of cavalier knockabout speeches throughout. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of argument on TV, and there's various literature and articles being written. But nothing has really got hold so far, because the official campaign only began yesterday, so we're still a long way off. But the outlines of the debate are already really obvious. I don't think they're going to stray very far. So let me quote from one excellent speech in favour of staying in the membership of the European Union, which I think summarises all the main arguments. And I quote, "At a time of uncertainty in world affairs, Europe gives us a far better chance of peace and security. If we wish our children to continue to enjoy the benefits of peace, our best course of action is to stay in Europe. The anti-Marketeers would like us to insulate ourselves from the rest of Europe and isolate ourselves from the remainder of the world. But neither the instincts nor the interests of this country are isolationists." Second quote, "It's still true, in the most literal sense of the term, that Britain's business is in the world. We rely on world imports for nearly all our industrial raw materials. We're the world's largest market for foodstuffs. To pay for both, we need to export to the world goods and services currently representing 1/5 of the gross national product. To take the gamble of leaving Europe will be reckless in the extreme." The third quote, "I do not deny that by comparison with her neighbours, Britain has for generations thought of herself as a power that was different in kind. Proudly so. It's this sense of distinctiveness that anti-Marketeers play upon when they promise independence by return of post. But their prospectus ignores the fact that almost every major nation has been obliged by the pressures of the post-war world to pool significant areas of sovereignty so as to create more effective political units." And then finally, the conclusion. "To leave such a community would not merely be a leap in the dark, it would be like a leap overboard from a secure ship into dark and uncharted waters." Now, all the arguments are there. The economic prospects of the country, the location of power, security, Britain's place in the world. There's a very contemporary speech. You might have picked up from a couple of the language that speech is 40 years old. Lady Margaret Thatcher, from the referendum campaign of 1975. It just shows you how much this argument is a repetition of the one before. How you're bounded by a speechwriter, by the facts, by the actual reality of the world in which you live. Now, I selected, as we always do, my material very deliberately. And in fact, the greater part of the speech, and this is where we see a difference between now and then, which I think is very important, the greater part of that speech was actually about security and peace. It's very interesting because that is low down in the order of priorities at the moment in our current argument. Thatcher made a big argument about the fact the European Union is the guardian of peace, because in 1975 it was still within the memory of most people who had been active in that referendum that the European continent had been in mortal danger, in conflict. And that argument was intensely powerful. And the speech is beautifully written, probably a Ronnie Miller speech. It's very well written, it's very well constructed, and it's very powerful. And it struck me, could we do that again? Because there is already the argument that the Remain case lacks poetry, just as there was in Scotland in the referendum. Independence is a poetic idea, whereas the Union is harder to make poetry of. Yeats said brilliantly once that we make poetry out of the quarrel with ourselves, but mere rhetoric out of the quarrel with others. Well, could we make some poetry out of this? Is there a quarrel here we could make poetry out of? The case is still true that the union of nations in a continent absolutely torn to pieces by conflict has preserved the peace. And in binding in Germany and France to a union of mutual interest, this has been an intensely civilizing institution. It remains true. Enlargement has been a further civilizing institution. In the part of the world where the conflicts began, this institution, which demands that you trade and you talk and you get in a room together and do things by persuasion, has been a fine harbinger of peace. It is a good thing for our security, just by its very existence, that Europe should cooperate. Is a historic achievement. If we instead of looking on a 40-year view, if we look on a 400-year view, it's a remarkable aberration that we've had half a century of European peace. And yet now it feels difficult to make that argument. I've tried with a few people, and particularly with younger people. The problem is not that they disagree so much as they take for granted the peace that there is. So there's no sense of risk. There's no sense of imminent threat. And if I say, well, we might go to war with France, it doesn't sound likely. I remember in government, at various points when Tony Blair was intent on invading all sorts of countries, Peter Mandelson once turned to him and said, well, before you know it, you'll be invading France. And he said, well, you know, there are days I wouldn't mind. But it's hard to create that sense of a risk of war. Whereas when you're in the immediate shadow of that war, it was easy. And Thatcher makes that case very eloquently. And I don't know that a speech of the same kind would carry now. David Miliband did a little bit of it the other day. He was talking about the diplomatic and security risks to Britain. But it was all rather abstract. It was all rather Britain's place in the world. True enough, and an important argument. In fact, in my own view, probably the most important argument in fact, but not necessarily one that's really going to carry with the electorate. Let me come on to the arguments we've had in this campaign. 4 of them. The first one is the economy. And most of the Remain campaign, a bit like Scotland, will be a projection of fear, be a projection of economic risk. The Remain campaigns will say millions of jobs will be lost as global manufacturers move to lower-cost EU countries. I'm quoting Jeremy Corbyn here, funnily enough. Britain's large, I never thought I'd say that, Britain's large foreign-owned car industry would be particularly at risk. And then there's a lot of trading of facts, a lot of material of how much GDP would suffer, how many jobs might conceivably be lost. There's a problem here, of course, in that in any good speech, you'll illustrate your points with a choice fact. Facts are hard to come by when you're talking about the future. By its very nature, it hasn't happened yet. So it's difficult. Each fact is contentious. And this demand that people want we want the facts, then we can decide. Well, it's difficult because it's not obvious what the facts are. It is not obvious what the impact on GDP will be if we left the European Union. We can only make intelligent surmise. So there'll be lots of that, and it makes it hard to nail the question, which is why the Remain side will exaggerate and will project a sense of risk which is probably greater than the truth. And I suggest that they do that, because that's how you win campaigns. Because there is a rhetorical excess in this argument on both sides. There's bound to be. It's going to be a fairly vivid and at times tawdry campaign. It will not be two people sitting there saying, well, on the one hand, it's going to be pretty brutal. There's one interesting argument, which is that if you go through the various scenarios for what happens if we leave, assuming you want membership of the single market, you end up on most of the scenarios renegotiating most of the regulations that you've just derogated from. So there's a case for saying that actually after 7 or 8 years of complex negotiation, you end up back where you started, only without the power to influence it. And in fact, Thatcher made that argument along 40 years ago. The risk with that, of course, is that you end up saying, as a Remain person, oh, it won't make much difference if we leave. And so that doesn't sound very powerful. That sounds the opposite of poetic. You want to say it's going to make an enormous difference. It's really going to matter. And the way you can connect that to people, which is the big problem in this whole argument, is to go from the abstract and the aggregate to the personal, is to say your jobs are at risk. And so you've seen the CBI coming forward with their own job number, 3 million. That 3 million number is a suspiciously round figure, which is always a tip-off. They just made it up. Why not 3.5, maybe? or 4? You just keep going. And you get all the numbers about the gain from the EU membership. So you've got all these numbers, and the risk argument is going to be very powerful for Remain. There are a few discernible benefits which you can add as concrete items in a case. Aviation reforms, for example, mobile telephone tariffs. There is a list of them that people don't know have got anything to do with the European Union, and that's quite a powerful case. You say, if we had not been a member of this trading bloc doing this negotiation, then it is unlikely we would have these benefits. And that's a useful argument to have. But the bulk of it will be about the risk, the uncertainty of leaving something upon which you will claim our economic security depends. The second argument for Remain is security and diplomacy, which is a bit different from peace. I mean, there is that argument I suggested before about peace in the world, but security and diplomacy is more about the diminished sense of Britain's place in the world, that in some way leaving the European Union is sort of giving up. Now, of course, the exiteers will dispute this. They say, on the contrary, Britain's a proud, independent nation, and it's reasserting our pride in our national sovereignty to become solo again. And in any case, it's not to become solo because we remain a member of NATO and various other international tribunes. So, but the Remain side can say, no, so much of what happens diplomatically is channeled through the European Union. And one of the best advocates for this will be Barack Obama. Obama's here soon and will be speaking on this. And generally, I think Obama's a better speaker than Jeremy Corbyn. And Obama has every right to participate in this argument, in my view. So does everybody from every country. Because Britain leaving the European Union would affect all the other nations too. And it could have a ratchet effect in the European Union itself. And for the Americans, who have a very good transatlantic relationship with us, they absolutely see us as the bridge to Europe. And the reason that David Cameron, who's quite a Eurosceptic personality, has been educated in government into being a lukewarm pro-European, which is what he is precisely because he's grown up enough to understand things like that. And he's worked it out. And Obama has made it clear to him And the more you're in government, the more you find two things. One is your utter infuriation with the European Union at every level, how unbelievably bureaucratic and ridiculous it is, and you desperately think, let's leave. And then the other thing is how important it is and how diminished you'd be if you weren't in it. That something important happens in those councils, and that you would be a lesser country. You would lose power. And so the crucial argument here is power. And David Miliband made this the other day. It's a difficult one to land because it's counterintuitive, that power is multiplied when it's shared, not diminished. It's easy to make the opposite case, that we'll get our power back. The exit people say this all the time, we'll get our country back, as if we're not in control of our country. It doesn't feel like that when you live in Britain. Certainly if you're John Whittingdale at the moment, it doesn't feel like there's no power in the country ranged against you. But that's the argument they'll make, and it's an easy one. It's a very clear case. So rhetorically, it's very powerful. Whereas the other case is more complex, that power actually is increased by being shared. We become more powerful as 28 than we are as one. You can make that with respect to trade deals. I find people can see that you have a better bargaining position if you're one of 28 when you're dealing with China than if you were doing a bilateral agreement. Still quite apart from the sheer horror of having to renegotiate all of those things, having disentangled yourself from the agreements we're currently in. But that is the second argument, that there is something about our place in the world which would be diminished if we were to leave. There are two big arguments on the other side that I think Remain has to counter. The first is power and sovereignty. We're a sovereign nation and we should be in charge of ourselves. So much of what happens in this country derives from Brussels. They tell us what to do. We gold plate every regulation. We are essentially in hock to faceless people in Brussels, some of whom shuttle every now and then to Strasbourg for reasons we've no idea why. It's the sort of phony democratic case. The EU is undemocratic, they'll say, and undermines national governments. They'll also say it's committed to ever closer union. And at this point, it's the only point in which I'll mention David Cameron's renegotiation. Really remarkable. I've done a couple of events over the last week about the European Union referendum. At no point in either of them did anybody mention the renegotiation that David Cameron did, which is ostensibly the point of this referendum. Of course, this referendum is the internal management of the Conservative Party, and the country's future is being put at risk for that, which I don't want to sound too pious about it, because Harold Wilson did exactly the same for the Labour Party in 1975. So it's just, this is what happens in low politics sometimes. But the country doesn't need this referendum in any meaningful sense. But nobody mentioned the renegotiation. Now, perhaps the only bit of it that might count is that Cameron secured some sort of opt-out from ever closer union. Not that ever closer union is particularly happening. The Eurosceptics just simply will not take no for an answer. And they have never really understood that John Major killed off the idea of a federal European Union with enlargement. The minute the European Union gets to 27, 28 members, it makes it almost impossible to get them to agree on anything. So the great frustration that you feel when you go there is not that it's this perfectly oiled machine moving towards a single government. It's that it's got none of the features of a well-oiled machine. It's that you can't do anything, not that they can do everything. And yet the Eurosceptics just don't understand that. Why somebody like Daniel Hannan, to whom I shall return, doesn't understand that? No, not a stupid person by any means, and experienced within the European Union. He must know, also a skeptic of the state. Here's something very interesting about the Eurosceptics. They are all skeptics of the state, generally speaking. Yet when it comes to the European Union, they think the state's immensely powerful and can do whatever it likes. It's remarkable. So a national state they think is hopeless. You wouldn't want your national government running the health service, for example, in their view. But if you've got 28 national governments, they magically can do whatever they want. It doesn't make any sense at all. And I don't know why Daniel Hannan's wasting his whole life on this single cause. There's so much more. He could have been a window cleaner or something. The second argument they've got is immigration. And this is a new one. This does not feature in the 1975 campaign in the same way. There's some limited conversation about border control, but it's not the same, because immigration now is routinely the second or third biggest question when the British public are asked what they care about. It poses a dilemma for both sides. For Remain, there's a risk that you sound like you're ignoring it as a question, or, as Jeremy Corbyn did, as though you're in favour of it. Now, in a way, good for him. He said what he thinks, and I happen to agree with him on immigration. He said simply, I don't think there are too many people in Britain. Well, I agree with that. Whether that's a wise thing to say in this argument, I'm not so sure, because there's a crucial fact about this referendum, which is that the Labour voters will win it, or not. You have to get the Labour vote out. There is no victory for Remain which does not go through Labour voters. There aren't enough pro-European Tories or pro-European non-aligned political people to win the argument. So you've got to get the Labour vote out. Labour MPs are reporting back that their constituencies are very sceptical and at the moment are likely to vote for out, or they're not going to vote at all, or both, because the passion is all on the side of exit and not on the side of Remain, which tends to be the case. The more complex status quo position is harder to inspire people towards. And this is particularly true in the Labour Party. And then there's another problem, which is that Labour voters are telling pollsters they're not going to vote in this Tory fight, when the only advocates of staying in are David Cameron and George Osborne. Labour voters are not responding to those voices. They need Labour voices to persuade them to vote. So it's why Corbyn's speech was hugely important yesterday. Just the fact of him making it was very, very important strategically in the campaign. Is the Labour campaign has to increase its velocity and its volume, and it could be the pivotal factor in the whole thing. Immigration also poses a dilemma for the exit side. In a sense, it's a good argument for the exit side. I'd say we can now take control of our borders. We don't have to have Poles and Romanians coming to be our plumbers. We can be our own plumbers, if we like. There's a slogan for you. But there's a problem with it, and the problem is this. If you go hard on immigration as a topic, this is true in general elections and it's also true in the referendum, for every person you add to your coalition on one side, you tend to lose one on the other. So someone who's unaligned, a floating voter, an undecided person, is likely to be put off if you sound too anti-immigration and too nasty, which is what happens with the anti-immigration debate. So you don't tend to increase your coalition of people, you simply deepen it. You cement the people who are already going to vote to leave. They really are going to vote to leave, and they definitely will turn out. And that's a useful thing to have. But you've got to be very careful that if you make that a big part of your argument, you don't leave yourself exposed on the other side of your coalition. And this was the argument between the two competing groups for the designation of which was the official campaign, the Vote Leave and the Grassroots Out. Because the Aaron Banks funded Grassroots Out were essentially an anti-immigration pressure group. They were going very hard on the European Union produces unlimited immigration and we need to clamp it down. And that, it's no surprise all the UKIP people were in that camp, and that is a very UKIP type strategy which can get you 14% but can't get you 20. And you've got to be very careful with those arguments, which are powerful but narrow. And what you do with an argument that's powerful but narrow is very tough, because if you make it powerfully, it is by definition narrow. So you have to put it down in the mix. My own view is that immigration they can't win on immigration for exit unless it's a very low turnout. If turnout gets to 50%, then it could be decisive. But if turnout gets above 60, then we're looking at the Remain side being a very good position on the current numbers. So immigration gives you a problem. Let me conclude, and I'll just take some questions. I don't remember where it came from, but there's a standard way of analysing speeches, which you'll all know, which is to say that there are three types of speeches: those which provide information, those which provide persuasion, and those which provide inspiration. And most, of course, will do all three. You have to have some information in order to persuade, and you're likely to have to be persuasive in order to inspire. But each speech will have a primary focus of one of those three. In this debate, the information is difficult to come by because it's hard to adduce facts. It's difficult to find facts, and they're actually quite boring. And they don't work. Even a number like 3 million jobs, it doesn't work because I only have one job. I'll tell you, if the Times is under threat from the European Union, then I'd definitely vote for out. But so my point is, we've got to personify this debate somehow. As the previous speaker was saying, I agree with that very much. And that is very hard to do in this argument because it's so big. And yet some attempt has got to be made to give this personification. I think the Remain side can and probably will get quite nasty about their opponents, which is to say, to label Farage as an eccentric and to label the case as eccentric for leaving, and to have some of those slightly oddball characters involved in the case, of whom Dan Hannan, I would suggest, is one, as standard bearers for Remain. So it's risky, but I think the sense that you'd be giving is, do you really want to line up with that lot? I know you don't know much about this thing, but it seems to work quite well. There's quite an economic risk, and he thinks it's a good idea to leave. And I think there will be some of that, because we have to get something that gets people interested. Because the primary act here, I think, in making the case, is not one of persuasion. There are some undecided people. The current polls have it 43% for Remain, 41% for exit, which leaves 16% undecided. I don't really believe in the idea of undecided people, because I think if you said to them, but it's tomorrow, what are you going to do? I think they'd know. Quite a lot of them won't vote, but the others, we think, are breaking for Remain. So the confidence of the Remain side rests on that breaking. So it may be that there is a small act of persuasion to be done, but the primary burden in this campaign is one of inspiration, which is to say, you've got to find something that makes people vote. You've got to find an argument that gets them out there so that they bother, so that they care. That's the task for the speech makers in this campaign. And that has to be some combination of economic risk, a sense of fear, and a personification of the argument somehow. And you'll notice that all of the case I've made has been very domestic. I don't think there's any hope of making a grander argument about Europe as such. I don't think that's peculiar to Britain, although we have an extended form of that sort of domestic insularity. But you have to make an argument to this domestic audience, a practical case. Keir Hardie once said, we are a practical people not given to chasing bubbles. A practical case based in risk and fear, which is as gruesome and as grim as necessary, and involves clowns on the other side. Because the case for leave is rhetorically very easy to make. It's very simple. And the case for Remain is sophisticated and complex. And sophisticated and complex don't win campaigns. And they don't make great speeches either. The great speech makers take sophisticated, complex ideas and make them seem simple. It's like sport. It looks easy. It's only afterwards you realise it's not easy at all. It's very difficult. And that someone has to do that, take this complex thing and distill it for those images, those people, those projected facts which can resonate. More prosperity or less. more security or less, more risk or less. It's a projection of an imaginary future. The politicians are sounding the trumpets on the city walls, but are the people listening? We shall see.
Well, questions. There was one. We don't have time for loads, but you can start. I saw you, Frank. I saw you, and I saw you. Yeah. And okay, Lech. Yeah.
I was surprised you mentioned both Scotland in your introduction in both in two contexts. First, the parallelism between the argumentation on the Scottish referendum, which ironically are very similar. Those who were arguing for the Scots to stay are now rejecting the same arguments coming for the Great Britain to stay, and the actual risk. I don't know if you perceive it here as a real risk that Brexit could cost Great Britain its integrity with Scotland if another referendum is introduced. So I work in Brussels, and over there it seems to be part of the discussion. I'm wondering if you see it the same.
I think the outlines of the argument are very similar, and the economic risk. I did say the economic risk that won the argument in Scotland will probably win the argument on the European Union too. The question of the union of Great Britain is very interesting because it is mostly the Eurosceptics, the people who want out, who are the most ardent unionists within Great Britain. Very strange paradox, and I know it's the thing that worries them the most. You take somebody like Michael Gove, for example, who is a former alumnus of this very college. Michael has been for leaving the European Union ever since he was here. This is where he learnt it, and that's his considered view, and very sincerely held. He's also, as a Scot living in London, deeply committed to the union of Great Britain. He's convinced himself that the two things are not connected, and that if Britain could perfectly reasonably leave the European Union but retain the union of Great Britain. Now, that might not be the way that Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish National Party see it, and it depends a bit on how Scotland votes. If Scotland votes to stay in, but Britain as a whole votes to leave, then it is probable that Sturgeon would use that as the opportunity to force another referendum. Whether the Scots would then leave, though, it's not certain. It depends how quickly it is, because the demographics are moving against independence in Scotland. Now, it's not going to happen very quickly, so if there's a quick referendum, maybe they'll leave. So it's possible, I suppose it's possible, we could leave the European Union on a 51-49 vote, and then 4 years later, the Union of Great Britain could break up on a 51-49 vote. It is possible. It is possible, and it's a risk. And it is, on reflection, something that the Remain side could use in the argument.
Thank you. Frank.
Thank you. I'm from the Netherlands. I don't hold it against me. And one of our major newspapers published around an op-ed recently by our country famous journalist, and he argued that we should turn around the argument and say to the British, well, why would we want you to stay? Go out if you want. We don't care. And I was interested to ask you, how would you counter that argument? How would you convince the European people that actually we should care about Britain staying in the European Union?
I think it's a fair point, actually. I mean, why should you care? Well, the reason you should care is because Britain is a useful ally in the European Union for a lot of really good causes. You go back to the 2005 speech to the European Parliament, there's a lot of things in there that Britain had really pursued. And Britain is like the licensed jester within Europe, allowed to say things that everybody else secretly thinks, but doesn't want to sound right-wing. So that's why you need us. And the Poles and all the new ones who want to stand up against France and Germany, they need Britain too. So there's a good case for why Britain is a good country to have within the European Union. But I agree, we're stretching the patience of other nations. There's no question about that. That if we keep complaining about this relationship forever, there comes a point when they'll say, well, you get on with it.
Go.
I think if the euro had gone well, which let's be honest, it didn't, then the European Union might be in a better position to be irritated with Britain. But we're in a position of some moral superiority for having foreseen that disaster. Well, some people did. I mean, actually, the government I was a part of would have been keen to join. I was always opposed to that, but the Prime Minister was keen to join, so we may well have joined in the disaster. It's to the credit of Gordon Brown, and it's not something I say very often, that we stayed out. But I think Britain has behind the scenes, people appreciate Britain's presence. But we've got to be careful. We're really pushing it at the moment.
Okay. You.
Thank you. That was very useful. But it was very useful as a kind of abstract. I was very struck by the fact that you didn't mention the press once in your talk there, whereas the reality of this is it's something that's refracted very strongly through media that have very polarized opinions. And I get the impression, I don't live in the UK, but looking at the press from abroad, from Brussels, it looks like the numbers in the press are stacked in favour of the exit.
Yeah.
I just wondered what thoughts you might have about whether this...
I think they are, and I think that will demonstrate to you that the power of the press is far less than most people think it is, including people who work in the press. I'm quite a heretic within my trade in that I don't really believe in the power of newspapers, particularly. There's an assumption that people make that newspapers follow their proprietors. Actually, newspapers follow their readers, and proprietors follow their readers, which is how they came to be proprietors in the first place. And the Times readers, for example, are 62% for Remain, 38% for Exit. It is therefore highly probable, for that reason, that the Times will come down on the side of Remain. I don't know, but that would be my assumption. The coverage is relentlessly hostile to the European Union in the Times. I mean, relentlessly. I mean, absolutely. But I think in the end, the commercial consideration will apply. And I think that's true of all the newspapers. So I think the first thing to look at when you're working about newspaper allegiance is just look at the readers first. What do they already think? Because you're serving a readership. So the Telegraph and the Mail have a pretty core Eurosceptic readership. Very probably will be for out. Within the Murdoch papers, I think there may well be a split. The Sun may be for out and the Times for in. The Guardian will be for in. The Independent online version will be for in. The FT will be for in. Will any of it matter? Do you know anybody who's sitting there thinking, I don't know anything about that, but I'm just waiting for that bloke in the Times to write a leader on the European Union. And then I'll decide. I don't really believe it. In fact, we often have a joke at work where we wrote a stiff second leader about Putin, and the next day he appears not to have changed his attitude at all.
So disappointing. The lady from Glasgow. Sorry, I forgot your name.
No worries. Thank you very much. This was both instructive and enjoyable. I wondered, as one of many, I hope, in this room who actually live here and have received this folder through our letterbox, this is the government's folder about why we should stay in the EU. And I wonder how you compare that to how your recommendations for phrasing the case for Remain. How do you think this folder fares?
Well, it's a little bit of like a child's book, isn't it? The folder. It's like a sort of Janet and John book. It's a government document, so it's very sober. So obviously it doesn't have a picture of Nigel Farage in a clown's outfit, the sort of thing I'm recommending. But the structure of its arguments are quite similar. I mean, if you look at it, it's quite economic and quite dry. And it's trying to suggest to you subtly that there's a lot of money tied up in our future in the European Union and that this is at risk. Now, it's a difficult document to write, actually, because they they can't make a case too heavily. They can't employ too much political rhetoric because it's a government document. And facts, as I said before, are quite hard to come by. Certainly facts about what might happen in the future. So it's a difficult document to do, which explains why it's not great. But I'm quite sympathetic to the fact that it's not great because it's difficult. And it's largely about the economy, and I think that's probably right. And there's an attempt to head off a couple of the counter-arguments. So there's a little section on immigration, fairly meagre and not very persuasive. What I thought about it when I read it was I thought won't persuade anybody. I read it and I thought, yes, I agree with most of that. The bit on immigration, if you have concerns about immigration and you're going to vote on that issue, the 4 lines about how we'll be able to secure our own borders within the European Union will not do anything to alleviate that concern. So I felt it's only £9 million. There's been a furore about the government spending money on making its case. I don't really mind that, but I doubt it'll make much difference.
Okay, thank you. Now, the only time Lek and Neringa, but unless you don't mind that we...
I think we should just 2 more, just 2 more.
Okay, Lek, Neringa.
Right, Bill.
Hello.
I will say that when you were talking about Farage in a town suit, I sort of imagined this image of a poster popped into my mind of Farage looking bug-eyed and crazy. I'm not sure where they'd find a picture like that, but with the slogan, "Are you thinking what he's thinking?" But in your book, your very good book, you make a passionate defence for the soundbite, like a rehabilitation of the soundbite. And this would be an evil question if I didn't think that you'd already thought about this. But if you were to distill...
I haven't. It's an evil question then.
I'm only recently a journalist. No, but if you were to produce a soundbite for the Remain campaign, where would it go?
Where would it go? I thought you were going to ask what would it be.
What would it say?
Right. Well, no, I'll answer where would it go because that's easier. Should we take the other question and then I can think about one. I'll take them both together.
Okay, Neringa.
The old classic technique,
You will get your
thinking
answer.
time.
And the answer can be all the others want us out, so we stay in.
Yeah.
So more something like that. Neringa.
Mine is much easier. You rightly pointed that actually this referendum affects other countries as well. So what do you think how other countries can help the in campaign to inspire those people, and what would be kind of counter-effective as well, the participation of other countries for the in campaign?
Yeah. Okay, it's a good question. I don't know there's a great deal they can do. I think that it will have to be it'll have to come through a British audience. The British audience is quite parochial, and it's good information to be able to say that these other countries all want us to remain in. So to have senior people in government from various other European nations making that case is a good thing to hear. So I would definitely encourage that to happen. I would, if I was in the Remain campaign, I'd very much want that. Because it's like piling up a whole series of endorsements. And the more sort of praise that's lavished on Britain in those endorsements, the better, really. It's because it's risk. The domestic case will all be risk. So to have some people saying we actually rather like you, you're useful, you're good for us as well as for yourselves would be a good counterpoint to the other part of the campaign. There's a risk. Where it would be counterproductive is if people begin to feel we're being told what to do by foreign interlopers. That is always a risk. You saw that a bit even with Barack Obama when he made an intervention in the debate. People thought it was completely inappropriate that he should come in. Now I think it's entirely appropriate. This is about an interdependent relationship, and it's absolutely right that everybody should weigh in and have a point. This was an issue in the Scottish referendum too, of course, because the Scottish referendum affected England and Wales enormously, but the English and the Welsh had nothing to do with it. And it's true on a much grander scale. So I would definitely encourage people to join in, to make their own case, and that will be resources for the Remain campaign to use. On the slogan, Lek, and they're working on this at the moment. They're trying to find things, and it's hard because you're trying to encapsulate quite a complex case, first of all, which is always difficult, and you've got more than one argument. So a slogan or a soundbite can only usually get one. So it's going to end up being something quite generic and quite flat, but will make the essential case. It's got to convey the risk. It'll be something like better off in. It'll be something like that, which isn't to claim too much, because there's a risk in the soundbite you claim far too much. And supporters of the European Union don't love it. And this is the asymmetry in the whole campaign. People who want to leave really don't like it. You know, they're fired by passion. Whereas people who want to remain, they don't love it. They just think they're probably better off in. And I know it sounds an incredibly lackluster slogan in a way, but the trick, of course, is always to capture the sense of your audience. We're not looking for poetry, or purple prose particularly. We're looking for something which captures the mood of the campaign. So I think it might be that. And I think then what they've got to do, when they decide a strapline, and they need one, they've got to be unembarrassed about it and just hammer it. And when I was in government, I was always quite embarrassed by our straplines, because they're so narrow, aren't they? I mean, I remember being in an election campaign with the slogan, "Forward, not back." As if time can move in any other direction. I said, it's two words are redundant. We could just say "forward." You know? Obviously, if you're going forward, you're not going back, aren't you? But I was assured that this would work, that it would convey the sense that we were the party of the future. I mean, I can't say the word. This is soggy cliches. This is the stuff you promised I wouldn't say. But it did work. It did work. It conveyed the mood of the campaign, which was that Labour had a whole load of ideas for what was going to happen next, and the Tories didn't really. That's all it meant. And it managed in 3 words to give a flavour of that. And therefore we repeated it over and over and over again. It went into every speech. And it was the death of the soul to write it. But it worked. And this is the great paradox of political speech writing. You are yourself a poet and a genius, and you write such dross.
Well, at least they won't choose, I hope, the slogan the Dutch used when we had our referendum 10 years ago about the European Constitution, and that was Europe, quite important.